Right, I've just hit start on the record function. So thank you everyone for joining me for a school sport program webinar under classification multiclass. It's just a little, or the aim of it is just to give a little bit more information around, disability swimming and what we do at state and national level, and then obviously filter down into region. Admit people as they come in. So my name's Michael Anderson. A little bit of my background and why I'm so heavily involved in this space is that I was a Paralympic athlete for a long while. I attended Beijing 2008, London 2012, and Rio de Janeiro 2016. So 3 games in total, bringing home a gold, a silver, and a bronze. And then obviously all the world champs, Pan Pacific champs, and major meets in between in that sort of 10-year career span. A couple of years before I finished swimming at that level, I sort of jumped in with Swimming Queensland at state level and started to sort of set up those next steps for a career path. So worked heavily in that participation side of things. Part of that was that this classification and disability swimming space, which then eventually led to me taking on the national classification role for Swimming Australia, which I managed for around 6 years. So I sort of know from grassroots level all the way through to international in this space, and hopefully we'll be able to help you at any point along the way. Just before going into it, if you ever have any questions, etc., I'm always at the Swimming Queensland offices, so feel free to yell out with any queries at any point in time, and we'll look to address them as they come. To the slides and share. So I'm hoping everyone can see this. So as I mentioned, we received a little bit of funding from the Department of Sport and Rec, in which we could tailor a few things. So part of that is working with disability swimming. So I'm doing a piece around the classification awareness. So classification multiclass. We also have teacher workshops where we're doing Swim Australia teacher accreditations for Learn to Swim. And then also the Swim Australia Teacher Learners of Disabilities accreditation, which allows you to sort of have that accreditation to work with participants with an impairment. That's sort of targeted and aimed at a younger participant, but it gives a very good understanding of it. So jumping into this sort of area, this is sort of targeting new to the sport or new to para and multiclass swimming. So it's kind of, trying to tailor it down a little bit, and hopefully it doesn't bore anyone too much. It sort of just caters to everyone. So effectively what is para swimming and what is multiclass swimming? So there's a little bit of a difference between the two, but they always get sort of intermingled along the way. So effectively para refers to those classes within the Paralympics, being S1 through to S14. And in which they can access and tap into those Paralympic pathway opportunities. So that's going through the pathway with, if you join a swimming affiliated club, it can be then, your interclub carnivals, your regional champs, your state champs, your national champs. And then, if you progress up the chain with that into team selection, it then opens the door for Paralympic Games and World Paraswimming World Championships. So multi-class swimming, so S1 to S14, we also have additional categories that Australia has brought into play, being S15 through to S19. These aren't generally administered throughout the world. We just use them to service our purposes in the country. So S15 through to 19 aren't able to access that Paralympic pathway. with the Paralympic Games, but they then have their own pathways through to Virtus Global Games, Deaflympics, World Transplant Games, etc. And they have their own governing bodies. Multi-class swimming also refers to a format of racing wherein all athletes of all different impairment types race against each other, and then we use calculators to determine who comes first, second, third to award medals as such based on ranking. This is multi-class point score calculators, but we'll jump into that a little bit later in the webinar. So effectively what we want to do in Australia, while it is admittedly very heavily focused on that S1 to 14 class with that Paralympic pathway, we also do want to cater to everyone as much as possible to allow as much inclusion and participation in the sport. So what is classification? It defines who is eligible to compete. It groups athletes with an impairment into classes according to how much their impairment affects their ability to carry out the fundamental activities of swimming. Provides structure for fair and equitable competition. Cerebral palsy, as an example, can have a large range, so the need for a scale is required. Individual racing against others of a similar impact of impairment. So that sort of focuses around the fact that, you know, you might have an athlete with mild cerebral palsy. They may be competing against someone with a different impairment, but the impact is as similar as possible within that classification to try and ensure fair and equitable racing. So fundamental questions of classification. Does the athlete have an eligible impairment? We'll jump into that a little bit later. Does the athlete meet the minimum impairment criteria for swimming? Just because they have that impairment doesn't necessarily mean that they are eligible to be classified. And then which sport class should be allocated once you've gone through that process of being assessed and given an outcome from the assessors. And then why do we implement the classification system? Effectively, the process is for the swimmer to ensure fair sport. So the eligible impairment types within para, i.e. the S1 to S14 class, we have S1 through to S10 being physical impairment. S11 to 13 is visual impairment, and then S14 is intellectual impairment. When you see that 1 to 10, it's effectively a sliding scale, 1 being the most severely impaired. So you might have someone who's a quadriplegic, etc., and then S10 being the least physically impaired. So for example, I myself was an S10. I've got nerve damage in my legs from meningitis as a child. I wasn't aware of it till I started swimming because it didn't have that large an impact in my life at the time. But then when I jumped in the water, a coach could pick up on that power deficiency and sent me away to get tested, which opened that door to go through that Paralympic pathway. We also then have the non-para classes, S15. So again, myself, I'm hearing impaired from meningitis and fit into that category as well. S16 being transplant recipients. S17 was brought in a number of years ago to cater to high performance. So if an athlete was classed not eligible, it allowed them to stay participating within the sport while they then chased additional medical information, etc., to go through that classification review assessment, hopefully within 12 to 18 months, to hopefully get back on the board and participating within the classification again. Australia also has 2 new classifications, S18 and S19. We're the only national sporting organisation anywhere in the world that has these 2 classes. I believe one of the Scandinavian countries has just copied our method for it as well. But again, the first NSO of any sport in any country in the world. So it's an exciting time for that as well. There are implications for those classes in this initial stage, but the idea around that is to protect the sport as a whole. I'll touch on that later on with the negative gearing. So effectively within this scale of the classifications, just because you have an impairment doesn't necessarily mean you are eligible to be classed in. So for example, for the S15, 1 to 10 physical impairments, you need to lose a minimum of 15 points within the assessment to be deemed eligible as an S10 athlete. If you lose more than 15 and start going to 25, 30, 40, you start to go down the scale into S9, S8, etc. An example of this might be clubfoot or talipes. So it's very borderline whether it's in or out, depending on how severe that impacts the athlete. If the severity is a little bit on the stronger side, they will be classed in, though if it doesn't impact as much, the athlete will remain non-eligible under multi-class and remain competing within the able-bodied system. So that, and again, another note around that, while governments all around the world do recognise different impairments, you know, could be PTSD or other mental health impairments, it doesn't necessarily fit within the scope of classification. And those standards are set by the International Federation, so World Paraswimming, or effectively International Paralympic Committee, World Deaf Sports, and Virtus as the Intellectual Impairment International Federation. As you can see, physical impairment is the largest classification, so 1 to 10. So it covers a larger range of impairment types. You can see them listed there as impaired muscle power, limb deficiency, leg length difference, short stature, CP, etc. So the process of classification, I've broken down into the para classes and the non-para classes just to be able to fit it on the page a little bit better. So effectively, physical impairment, you go through the assessment, you have a medical classifier who does a bench test, similar to doing a musculoskeletal screening. And depending on the impairment will determine what assessment is completed. Once the athlete has gone through that bench test and has lost the minimum 15 points, they are then able to progress to the water component of the test or the technical assessment. The athlete must lose the minimum points to be able to, you know, go through to that next stage. They then jump in the water and they go through with the technical classifier. And the reason to that is there's a number of exceptions that are applied to try and prevent that athlete from being disqualified when they're competing. For instance, if an athlete has one arm, for breaststroke and butterfly, they can't necessarily or cannot touch the wall with two hands. So they get given an exception, meaning they're allowed to touch with one hand. You would think common sense, but the rules and regulations stipulated by World Aquatics determine that the technical officials, if they didn't have that exception, would disqualify that athlete. S11 to 13 being vision impairment. So S11 is completely blind. They either wear blacking goggles to ensure they can't see anything out if they do have eyes. If they have prosthetic eyes, they don't need to wear the blacking goggles. S13 being, again, similar to 1 to 10. They can see a little bit more, but they're still vision impaired or legally blind. So they go through that process through referring back to 1 to 10, Swimming Australia and the states, Swimming Queensland, administer that process, whereas S11 to 13 is administered by Paralympics Australia. So they have a form on their website where you just request a classification and then they work with the athlete or the family to go through that. So the athlete will see their ophthalmologist or optometrist, in which that data then goes to Paralympics Australia and they will assign a national classification. I'll touch on provisional, national, international, etc. a little bit later. but that's the standard at a national level. And then if they're going through the Paralympic pathway with World Para Swimming, they then do an additional sport assessment. So they're watching the athlete compete, etc., which we don't do nationally. We do for physical on odd occasions. The same goes for S14 with intellectual impairment. So they require an IQ of 75 or below and the completion of an adaptive behaviour assessment. That must have an onset of prior to the age of 22. So they're the same as the vision. It's just go through that process with the psychologist, get that IQ testing completed, send that off to Sport Inclusion Australia as the administering body, and then they return the outcome of eligibility, and it goes into the Swimming Australia master list to show that they're eligible to compete under multi-class. If that athlete then goes through the process to international level with team selection and under World Para Swimming, they'll then do the same as vision, in which they then have to go through that process with World Para Swimming assessors, and then they're viewed in competition as well. S16 is administered by Transplant Australia, so it requires an organ and or tissue excluding blood donated by another person. They've just got the form on their website, fairly simple process. Just submit it to Transplant Australia, and then they send out the eligibility once it's been ticked off and approved. S15 being hearing impaired, goes through Deaf Sports Australia. They've got the form on their website where the athlete just sees their audiologist at home, gets those results or the outcome of that, submits it, and they grant the eligibility based off that. That requires 55 decibels or more in the better ear. So an example of that is I'm fully deaf in my right ear, can't hear a single thing. My left ear is effectively 55 decibels. I have a hearing aid in, but if I was a fractionally less, I'd be classed not eligible, despite not being able to hear in the right ear. So given I meet that minimum eligibility, it then bumps me into that S15 class. S18 is intellectual impairment with a significant other impairment. So the reason to that is that Virtus is looking to progress their inclusion into the Paralympics, or are pushing to get that. Paralympics won't recognise a syndrome, a Down syndrome, so they need to look at ways at which they can tick the boxes to ensure that it gives them their best way forward with attempting to get that class in. I'm not sure where that sits. That's with Virtus. S19 is autism, so it requires a diagnosis of autism, ASD, or Asperger's, and that goes through Sport Inclusion again as well. It's a paperwork process, and then Sport Inclusion Australia will let us know the eligibility, and we will add that athlete to the master list. And if they're a member of a Swimming Australia club, we will then put that classification against their Swim Central profile so that they're able to nominate for meets. So once a classification process has been completed and the outcome has come back, a number of things will happen. So the sports class will be applied. So S being freestyle, backstroke, or butterfly, you'll see it on the little snapshot here. SB being breaststroke, and SM being medley. So if that athlete, like the numbers are a little bit different, if that athlete is swimming freestyle, backstroke, or butterfly, they swim as an S8. If they're swimming breaststroke, they swim as an SB7. They are also given exemptions if they apply through the technical assessor, in which you can see here A612 plus. I'll jump onto that in a little while. And that allows them to circumnavigate the rules that the TOs are administering at a competition, and will avoid them getting disqualified for something that's naturally out of their control given their impairment. The sports class status refers to whether they're a provisional, a national, or an international swimmer. So a provisional swimmer is someone who has gone through the process with their home physio, for instance, instead of one of the national classifiers. And it's more just a process of keeping it as fair as possible, because a home physio may apply those assessments slightly different to another home physio, etc. Someone in WA may do it different to someone in Queensland, will do it different to someone in Darwin. Whereas a national class status has been applied by a national panel, so assessors that have been ticked off by World Paris Swimming and have gone through the training under them. So it's trying to create that more equitable outcome. It's more of a similar standard. You'll then have review. So NE sport class status, NE being not eligible if they don't meet the minimum eligibility. Confirmed if they're good to go. This generally applies to older athletes because their body's not changing as much. Review generally applies to younger athletes or conditions that may alternate or vary slightly over time. And the reason to this is if you have a 12-year-old that gets assessed, if you see them 3 years later, 6 years later, it's going to be a very different body to what you assessed at the original assessment. If it's just a review with no review date, it means they can be seen at any time. And if it's a fixed review date, it means they can't be seen until that year. So in that little snapshot of the example of the Swimming Australia National Classification Master List, you'll see over on the right-hand side that you've got a couple of empty spots, and then you've also got the review date of 2024 and 2025. So if that fixed review date has been set to that year, it means that athlete can't come in until that year unless they prove that a specialist has documented that there's been a significant change in impairment, in which we'll get a national classifier to tick it off, approve it, and remove that year and allow them to come in earlier. Up at top here, we've got the swimming, and this only, I know this is targeted more towards school sport, but if that swimmer or athlete is a member of a Swimming Australia club, as you can see in the case of Rowan Crothers here, it's got his club up top, Yeronga Park Swimming Club Incorporated, his name, the membership of this current season, but then it's also got his multi-class S10, SB9, SM10, with the little green tick next to it, showing that he's eligible. The little exclamation mark, we don't have that great control over the Swim Central system, which is a CRM for membership within Australia. So the little exclamation mark applies to exceptions. If he had a review date, I believe he's a confirmed athlete, but if he had a review date, you would then see the review year under those exceptions. So jumping into the exceptions, at this point in time, we're unfortunately operating on two different systems. World Paris Swimming brought out a new system a number of years ago, the assessments, that is, classification rules and regulations, which they sort of type hold on the material around it, and national federations weren't able to access that. So in the current national system, we're operating on the old IPC classification rules and regulations from, I believe it's 2017 document, which has these exceptions. So you'll see that it applies with the A, assistance required. For starts, that'll apply to someone that's maybe in a wheelchair, requires a bit of help getting up on blocks or into the water, maybe an amputee that has a prosthetic leg and requires help if it's a 50-meter race where they jump in, dive, swim to the other end. They need someone to carry their leg up to the finish end. E, unable to grip for a backstroke start, means they'll generally have the assistance as well, but they'll start on their back and then they'll have someone helping them holding onto their feet, and it'll be a release start. Hearing impaired, so this can apply to multiple people. It's not specifically only for the S15 class, but those athletes will have the option for a light start, in which a light's placed near their block that goes off when the starter goes. At some smaller clubs or pools that don't have that light available, you can do a tap release starting, which someone stands behind them with a couple of fingers on their ankle. And then when the gun goes, they'll release their fingers, meaning like giving the signal that the athlete is right to start. TAPS relates to vision impaired athletes. So you may have seen Paralympics where you've got athletes with a vision impairment racing, and you'll see people at the end of the lane banging them with large sticks because they obviously can't see the wall as they're coming in. So they've got their own distances that they've interpreted to be best for them. And then when they're hit, they know exactly how many strokes to take to the wall so that they don't, cause injury to themselves. Y is the starting device. So this may apply to a short-statured athlete or a lower class athlete where they can't reach, for instance, in a backstroke, they can't reach those grips, handlebars. So they put a rope around it, hold onto a rope, and then go from there. We jump over into the exceptions that apply during swimming. And then these are all administered by the technical officials throughout a meet. Pretty general, right hand touch, left hand touch, simultaneous intent to touch with the other hand, which may apply to someone with cerebral palsy where they can't necessarily extend both arms out at the same time. One's got a bit more of a contracture in which they physically can't extend that arm. So it allows them to extend touch with that one hand with the intent to touch with the hand that's a little bit more locked in. And then 7, 8, 9 referred to more of the legs, part of upper body. And then leg drag or show intent to kick for those athletes that have more of a impairment on the legs. Then tells you what exceptions are able to apply for the strokes for free back, butterfly and breast. So then we jump into the new international system under World Para Swimming, which came in 2018. And you'll see the old exceptions there, and then jumping over to the new exceptions. So you can see they've done away with the exceptions that apply as an overall sort of rule, and then broken it up into individual strokes with the breaststroke and butterfly, one hand and simultaneous intent. But that's all administered by the technical officials. So it's good to have that understanding of it. And if you have any confusion around it, always worth touching base with the TOs throughout the meet just to query it and get a better understanding of it. Given we've currently got old and new exception codes in the Swimming Australia National Classification Master List. The codes that are under IPC, the old ones, have a little asterisk in front of them. So that only applies to exceptions 2 to 6, because you'll see that in the new one, 6 has been taken out and 2 to 5 have been changed into something else. So it causes those TOs' job a little bit more stress because they've now got to realise who's internationally classified, who's nationally classified, because those numbers could mean two things. We are looking at a piece for the assessors. We do national classification assessments at National Age Championships for Swimming Australia every year. So leading into this one next month, we are looking at a piece to do a transfer of the old codes into the new codes, which will hopefully make it much easier and just stick to the one set of numbers. So I won't touch too much on competition pathways because this can change depending on the school system, etc. I don't know too much about that, in all honesty. I came up through New South Wales, so it was different again. But over on the left-hand side, we've got the general competition structure within Swimming Australia, where you start club nights and championships into club meets. Regional championships, for instance, Brisbane Swimming Senior Mets, FNQ championships, which lead into state championships. So the one we do in December every year is the 2023 Hancock Prospecting Queensland Championships, which is our big meet. And then that leads into the National Champs, which is Age and Open, which is generally around April every year. There's also team selections, which can vary, but that will be dependent on when in the year the benchmark meet, so Paralympics or World Champs, is scheduled. So for instance, this year, trials for Paralympic athletes is at the Open Championships next month, because they leave mid-July to go for their World Champs, whereas the trials for the able-bodied team or the Olympic team is in June. And that's just to give a little bit more time. They don't want the para athletes to be competing for team selection to then have to leave 4, 5, 6 weeks later to, peak again in their training schedule at that benchmark meet. And then that obviously leads on to, depending what the classification is, as to whether they then target Paralympic Games 114, Commonwealth Games. This is a very different one. Commonwealth Games is a restricted set of classifications, so it's not a full classification schedule, and that's determined by the organising committee. So you might have an S9 400 free, you might have an S7 50 free, but not every class is represented within that 114. S14 also has that ability to go to the Virtus Global Games, which is also open to S18 and S19 classes. So it's another avenue in which they can pursue up the chain. There are other ones, S15 Deaflympics, S16 World Transplant Games. There's also other ones as well, like the World Dwarf Championships, etc. And then school sport, I've just done a general line there. Could vary depending on the school system you're within, but school, district, regional, state, national, etc. So the multi-class point score, this is the one that generally causes the most confusion. So if we're going to throw, within Australia, we don't have the numbers that cater to individual class competition, i.e. all S6s can't do 100 freestyle, and then S8s do 100 freestyle, S9s do 100 freestyle, S10s do 100 freestyle, etc. We don't have the numbers to cater to it, and that's when meet will bulk out into weeks and weeks. The Paralympic Games and World Championships do that, but an example of that is that the Paralympic Games goes for 10 days for the swimming competition itself, so it bulks up and adds a lot of time. So to get around that nationally, we operate in a multi-class format in which all classifications compete together. And then we utilise the calculators which are built into the system to denote who comes first, second, third, fourth, etc., etc. And the way that does that is we create a base time, which is generally the world record for those classes. So an S6 would be their world record for about 100 freestyle. S8 is their the S8 world record, S9, the S9 world record, etc. It then goes into that calculator, which then the world record generally is 1,000 points, being the base time. And then the further away you get from that world record, the point score drops. So if you're doing, 50 freestyle, an S10 athlete might do 25 seconds. The world record for that might be 21 seconds. That 25 seconds may be around the 600 to 700 point score. There's an example down the bottom here. And the reason for this is to create a system where it's that class competing against themselves, not the other classes, to try and make it as fair as possible. So it's not necessarily who touches the wall first, it's who's closest to their world record. Someone in a wheelchair may be 20 seconds behind, but they may be closer as a percentage to their world record than the S10 athlete, who is 10 seconds behind their world record, for instance. So that lower class athlete will win the gold. There is a little bit of a change up in those calculators in that we apply negative gearing to try and make it as equitable as possible, because not all events are contested across the board regularly. So an example of this, we apply a 5% loading to non-Paralympic events. So as an S10 athlete myself, We didn't have certain events. Just trying to think what. 200 freestyle was one, so we'd apply 5% loading on that world record to make it a little bit harder to compete against. The reason for this is if it's a Paralympic event, everyone around the world is competing in those events regularly because it means team selection. So those standards or world records are becoming more and more competitive over time, whereas events that aren't Paralympic events don't necessarily get the same love. This also applies to other classes because generally there's more events targeted towards that para event. So an instance of this could be the S16 class. Their records are only set every 2 years, I believe, at the World Transplant Games. But the instance with that is if a world record is broken or a games record is broken in the 2-year period in between, those records aren't updated. So across that 2-year period, it could be broken, and then at the games themselves, they could swim slower, or the athlete who has been breaking that record doesn't attend that games. The record remains the same. It's not really a realistic record as it stands. So we apply a little bit of a heavier loading to try and counteract that as best as possible. One that has caused a lot of confusion with that negative gearing is that S19 class. And the reason for that was when we brought that in, it was at exhibition level with Virtus. So they were still going through the processes of ticking that off as an eligible classification within their own system. So we applied a standard of the Olympic or able-bodied world record, applied a 25% negative gearing on it. So put that into context. If the world record for men's 50-meter free is a flat 20 seconds, we apply that negative gearing, that world record becomes 15%. We've reduced it by a quarter, which makes it much, much harder. And the reasoning to this is to protect the sport as a whole and the classes that have been competing and regularly bringing their world records down consistently. So, for instance, the para classes might have been around 60, 70 years. I'm not exactly sure. I should know my history. But they've had 60, 70 years head start on making that a very competitive world record, whereas S19 coming in as a new class, they don't have world records established and they're still not currently yet, but it would be unfair for them to come in with a clean slate and just start overtaking everyone. So that's to try and counteract that a little bit. That was just, the S19 class was just signed off internationally by Virtus recently. So as a result, we've taken that step to then pull that gearing back from 25% to 10%. I believe where the update in the high-tech meet manager calculator has come out. I don't manage that within Swimming Queensland, so I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it has. So within the system itself, it will operate under that new 10% loading rather than the 25%. And that's caused a little bit of confusion with those athletes coming in under S19 being classified eligible to race multiclass, but not realising the effect that negative gearing would have in pushing them towards the back of the rankings. But over time, as the world records come down, it will allow for a more consistent approach in which they can get more and more competitive. We just got to let the system do its thing and let those records be established. So you can see that little example down the bottom there. I've just done just to try and get similar point scores over on the right, but an S6, which is likely short stature, an S10, similar to myself, and S14 being intellectual, impairment of 75 or below IQ, and an S19 athlete with autism. So I've done 35 seconds for the S6 just to show relative to the other classes, and I've done 30 seconds for the 10, 14, and 19. So you can see that 466 despite it being 5 seconds slower compared to the S10. So in that race, the S10 athlete is 5 seconds behind the S6. They come second because they're 6 points lower. And then S19 with that negative gearing of 25%, hits that 246. So I've touched on what I sort of thought may be encompassed in this area under classification and multi-class. Hope it answered a few questions. As I said at the start, I'm here at any point in time if you want to email me or call me, any questions, and we'll address that as it comes and move with it. I obviously have a very deep passion within this area, and I want to see Queensland sort of take to the front nationally and internationally. Leading into Brisbane 2032, I think it gives us a great opportunity to sort of have some homegrown members within the state, get up on that international stage, at home and do well. We're very well equipped within the office with pathway development. We've got some great minds in there that have started up some good programs that we can work with. So ideally, the more athletes we have, the better it is, because it just gets more and more competitive. So I've just listed a couple of the additional websites here where you can find additional information. So I've just done Swimming Queensland as a top, given we're delivering it. There's a multi-class swimming page there that has a lot of info. The Swimming Australia website is generally where I sort of steer people towards, because it's the most up to date. There's a couple of documents there around, that are explanatory guides around classification. And then that's also where the calculators are housed, along with some other information relevant. I've also added the Paralympics Australia, Sport Inclusion Australia, and Transplant Australia websites, where you will go to find that information around the classifications from S11 through to S19. But if there is any questions that do arise, please feel free to email that through, give me a call in the office, or reach out in any capacity, and we can look to address that. If there's enough to warrant a second webinar answering with those queries, I'll definitely look at getting that set up, and we'll go from there. But thank you again, everyone, for jumping on board on a Wednesday night. It's great to have you here, and hopefully it's sort of delved into that classification multi-class space with disability swimming a little bit more